Okay, greetings citizens of Athens and welcome to commentary video number 4 for the trial day. The main person on trial was Socrates, though of course anyone could bring anyone to trial. It's part of the rules of trial day. But we'll look first at the trial of Socrates, and the charges brought against Socrates by the prosecution were impiety and corrupting the youth. So let's start with arguments for impiety. So main claim, Socrates is guilty of impiety. Let's look at this as an argument in standard form, explicitly identifying our premises. Okay, premise 1, Socrates rejects traditional depictions of the gods. Evidence for this claim might be something to the effect that he explicitly and unequivocally claims that certain depictions of the gods are false. He even suggests banning teaching Hesiod and Homer, which is basically the foundation of Athenian education. Of course, this happened in the Republic, right? So that might be pretty basic support for this kind of claim that he rejects traditional depictions of the gods. Now let's spell out the rest of the argument so that it's a valid deductive argument. Okay, so if premise 1 is that he rejects traditional depictions of the gods, and the conclusion is that what he's done is impious, the next premise needs to connect this rejection of traditional depictions and impiety. So, rejecting traditional depictions of gods is impious. Now, there are 2 steps to evaluating an argument. Do the premises support the conclusion? Yes. This was set up to be a valid deductive argument, so absolutely, the premises support the conclusion. So if there's a problem with the argument, it's that one of the premises must be false. So are premises 1 and 2, true or false? Let's look at premise 1. This one seems pretty straightforward. Whether or not it's true or false depends on what Socrates actually said, or perhaps meant. So if we, of course, as we are, assume that Socrates said all the things in Plato's Republic, well then, yes, he said these things. I can point to exactly the page numbers, which we are taking to be, for the purposes of the game, essentially transcripts of what he said. So yes, he said those things. So how could you get around attributing them to Socrates? Well, you might argue that we should interpret his saying these things as him playing devil's advocate, or, Glaucon and Adeimantus led him down this path, and he's just spitballing and developing arguments. Essentially, the question is, insofar as he's proposing this ideal city, does he actually believe this is the ideal city, or is this him picking up on whatever his students have suggested and trying to follow it to its logical conclusion to see what we can learn? Should we hold him to these claims or not? That's an interesting open question, right? But there's a pretty good case for holding him to it, unless you have, basically the question is, who has the burden of proof here? And we might say we should hold him to what he's saying unless we have good reason to interpret him as not meaning what he says. What about premise 2? Well, this one depends on definitions of impiety. It's one way you could reject it. Now, let's step back for a moment and not demand a definition of impiety. Let's just say we all agree. It doesn't even make sense to question whether or not this is an example of something that is impious. In which case, giving the definition doesn't really matter, as long as it's absolutely true that rejecting traditional depictions of the gods, as a matter of fact, is an example of impiety. If that's true, then the definition doesn't really matter. However, if you are challenging the definition of impiety, and that you think if we fully understand the definition of impiety, it'll turn out that this kind of thing just isn't how we should think about impiety, well then doing that might help you to undermine premise 2. Or alternatively, if you think that traditional basic pre-theoretical conceptions of impiety, which would suggest something like this as an obvious example, are bad or false or something, that, again, that's another reason why you might want to challenge the definition. So the plausibility of this premise really depends on whether or not it's worth challenging our definitions of impiety. What do you think about that? Good open question. In addition to just pointing out that Socrates claimed certain things were false, people also pointed out Socrates' just general approach to thinking about piety, where he was questioning our very understanding of what it is to be pious, basically pushing us on the definition of impiety. And so at least one person, maybe a couple, pointed out that Socrates generally has radical views about piety. So let's try to spell that out into an argument. Well, since we want the conclusion to be Socrates is guilty of impiety, the second premise would be radical views of piety are impious. Is that the connecting, is this the principle? Is this what's wrong with having radical views of piety? Like if somebody said, what Socrates does is real bad, and you say, what exactly is it that he did? He's got radical views of piety. And you say, but why is that bad? And if someone said, well, that's impious, that might be possibly true, but is that the most interesting claim about why it's bad? Table that question for now. Maybe there's a different way to set up what's the problem with radical views of impiety as an argument. But since the conclusion we're going for originally is he's guilty of impiety, this premise too could be true, and in fact it seems like it's pretty plausible, if not very informative, and it would make the argument valid. So what is the evidence for premise 1? Why think that this is true? Well, if you use the Euthyphro as your text here, you can, and if you take Euthyphro to be espousing traditional conceptions of piety, which I guess is an open question, it would require some understanding of the historical time period. Is what Euthyphro is suggesting pretty traditional? That's a question. Socrates clearly rejects Euthyphro's proposed conceptions of piety. So if Euthyphro is traditional and Socrates rejects them, you might say that he has a radical view of piety, although others opposed to this and said that he doesn't actually hold any views at all. He's merely undermining traditional ones. It doesn't mean he actually has any himself. So how could you go further to develop what his actual views about piety are? This might connect with a slightly more specific claim about Socrates' views, which again can be supported by Euthyphro and would be even better supported by a pretty, by more in-depth analysis of the Republic. But basically, I think we do see this in the Euthyphro. All of Euthyphro's proposed answers to the question, what is piety, essentially connect piety, or maybe more generally morality, what you ought to do, what the right thing to do is, with the gods. And in the Euthyphro, insofar as Socrates challenges this, what he might be challenging is the relationship between morality and gods, or something to do with the gods, whether it's where morality comes from, or whether it's what it means to serve the gods, or whatever. He's severing this connection between morality and the gods, or maybe to our more contemporary ears, morality and religion. And if you were to, so then you might respond that, no, the Euthyphro it's an aporetic dialogue. It ends in no answer to the question. It's a puzzle. He doesn't propose that there's no connection between piety and the gods, or between religion and morality. He just points out conceptual problems for the connection. That's all. It's up to us to figure out how exactly the two are related. Or you might think that, no, he really is severing the connection, and he thinks that we ought to understand morality. The right thing to do independently of the gods or all of morality. Basically, you'd have to have some more well-developed theoretical view. In any case, premise 1 depends on what exactly piety is, or what's a radical view of piety, and it depends on what exactly Socrates said. So you'd spell that out. And then premise 2, radical views of piety or impious, also seems to depend on a definition of impiety, though maybe if we agree that radical views of piety are just obvious examples of impiety, then we don't have a big question for number 2. But if you have alternative definitions you think are plausible, then that would undermine premise 2. At any rate, these are the big open questions, and these are the ways you could go about challenging this kind of argument. Now, we did mention that premise 2 is one way you could say what the problem with radical views are, but there's another way we could spell this out, and actually this is an argument, I think, from Lycon in 530, who spelled it out slightly differently. When it comes to what exactly the problem with challenging our traditional conceptions of piety is, well, one thing we could say is, well, that's impious, but as Lycon 530 said, it's something like treasonous. And maybe there could be some other reason why it's wrong to challenge our conceptions of piety. But let's look at this claim that it's treasonous. Okay, so same premise, Socrates has a radical view of piety and used the same evidence, whatever it was, and we'll change premise 2 to having a radical view of piety is treasonous. Now, if we want to make that claim, we need to connect. So treasonous, it has to do, it's a political thing, right? And piety is typically a religious thing, something related to the gods. I mean, at least that's the assumption of the traditional view that Socrates is supposedly challenging. So whatever it takes to support premise 2 is going to have to clearly link piety with the state. So you'll have to spell out the relationship between the state and gods, and explain how espousing some radical view about the relationship between the state and the gods and what we ought to, or claims about what we ought to do, how that undermines something related to the state such that we can call it treason. Like, how to spell this out is an interesting open question, if this is the right approach, but that's how you'd have to do it. Now, there seems to be another problem with the way I've set up the argument here, is because when it comes to making really good, clear philosophical arguments, saying exactly what you mean matters. And so I realize, as I'm trying to figure out, if I want to spell out why having radical views of piety are treasonous, I noticed that to spell that out, I started thinking like, well, espousing radical views undermines something having to do with the state or the democracy or whatever. And I believe this argument came up in Lycon's argument that Socrates corrupts the youth, maybe. I can't remember which part it came up in. But this, what's the problem with espousing? I realized I didn't really have that in the actual argument itself. Right now it just says, has a radical view, like in his head. Having a radical view of piety is treasonous. So this makes your thoughts a crime. Are we trying Socrates for a thought crime? I mean, maybe, but is that what we mean to be arguing? Or do we mean to be arguing that he's taken his thoughts into the public sphere and has corrupted people with them, or done something that will influence people in a way that counts as treasonous? If so, let's at least just be clear about our language, let's mean what we say. And say what we mean. Okay, so it's not just that he has a radical view, it's that he has and espouses a radical view of piety. He's out spouting it and convincing people of radical things, and these radical things undermine something having to do with the state and is essentially treasonous. Spell out your argument. Okay, so if these premises are true, the conclusion does follow. Are these premises true? Does he really have a radical view of piety? And is it true that having such a view and espousing it is treasonous? spell this out. These are the points where you can evaluate this argument. Okay, let's look at arguments to the effect that Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth. Okay, we know that the conclusion is supposed to be Socrates corrupts the youth. So here's a really basic, I want to set this up as a valid deductive argument. I'm just going to start sketching it in because even after looking at the arguments we saw, I wasn't sure what the best way to put this into standard form would be. But the general pattern that would make sense is Socrates does something, let's call it X. That something has a corrupting influence. The conclusion is that he corrupts the youth, so the youth should be in the premises somewhere. Either Socrates is doing X with the youth, like questioning officials in front of them. X has a corrupting influence on whoever's present, on the youth specifically. Thus, Socrates corrupts the youth. You can spell it out in different ways, but this will be, I think, the essential structure of how you argue for this. What is he doing? Why is that thing corrupting? Thus, he is corrupting the youth. And we might also question, like, how do we, insofar as you claim something is corrupting, how do you know that this thing has a corrupting influence? Does it really corrupt the youth? Okay, so let's look at some examples of the things he's doing and then figure out how to argue for those things corrupting the youth. Okay, so across all of the speeches from both of the assembly sections or the trial days, I came up with this list. I think it's complete of what we heard. So what is it that Socrates is actually doing? And importantly, I took this all from the prosecution. He's making a fool out of people. Who exactly is he making a fool out of? Does it matter who the people are? Likewise, he insults people. At least one argument said he's making a fool out of the students or the young who follow him around himself. That's perhaps questionable, whether or not he's making a fool out of them. He interacts with different, if you look at him across, we haven't read that many dialogues, and the ones we have read are all kind of non-standard, except for, but in any case, if you read enough of these dialogues, you'll see that he interacts with different people differently. The interlocutors bring something to the table themselves, and how Socrates interacts with them depends on who they are. So who is it he's making a fool out of, and how is it that they come to be made out as fools? Okay, so this is the claim. Fools and insulting. There's also a claim that he's a hypocrite, so he seems to be showing that people don't know anything, but also he claims not to know anything. Claim that he is a hypocrite there. Could be spelled out. How exactly that's hypocritical. All of these, of course, should be spelled out. What is the evidence that he does these things? The claim that he undermines our traditional systems of education, citations or references to the Republic on that point, proposes bad alternative systems of education, so we would need to see what exactly the alternatives he proposes are, and we'd also need an argument to the effect that they are bad. And he challenges democratic principles. He's proposing alternative forms of government. Again, support that in fact he says this, and also that it is a problem or that it's bad. That it basically two questions we have here. Are all of these claims actually true? Does he do these things? And question two, are these things corrupting influences? Now, the people who are defending Socrates might want to undermine these claims themselves and say, these are not things he's actually doing, you misunderstand him. Or, insofar as he does do some of these things, you might want to argue, these are not corrupting things. Okay, so let's look at why we might think that Socrates' actions, whichever ones we're interested in, are corrupting. Well, there are two general approaches. here. One is we could look at the actions themselves. So if speaking out against traditional forms of education, is that a corrupting thing to do? What we're looking at is his specific action, its nature, its influence, right? Or alternative two, we could look at the individuals that Socrates has in fact influenced and show that those people are corrupt. And so this is definitely something the prosecution did, specifically identifying Critias and Alcibiades as people who were influenced by Socrates and who are corrupt. Now, of course, to spell this out, I'm not actually going to set this one up in standard form, but to spell out this approach number 2, you would have to claim that these individuals are in fact corrupt or were corrupt, that they were influenced by Socrates, and that specifically his influence was important to the fact that they were corrupt or that they did bad things. Okay, let's turn to the arguments for acquitting Socrates. There are going to be 2 general approaches here, and this is generally true of arguments. Approach number 1 is undermine the arguments made by the prosecution. This is it's always important to consider alternative views and objections, but this seems to be the place to even start in this particular context, where you have, especially when you think about the burden of proof within a trial situation where somebody has brought a charge against you and they have to defend it, so just merely undermining their charges is enough, to win. Like, you, especially if, as is the case in our contemporary legal system, you get to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, right? So just merely undermining the arguments against you is an important strategy. But of course, there's the second strategy, which is to provide positive arguments of your own for the alternative conclusion, not merely undermining the prosecution's arguments. Let's look at the first kind of strategy. So the prosecution has argued that we can tell that Socrates is a corrupting influence. Look at people who are influenced by him who are also corrupt, right? So they've given 2 examples. And now the defense can either try to undermine these bad examples, as in trying to challenge whether or not a mentor or somebody who influenced someone in some way is responsible for everything they go on to do or for these things specifically. So we definitely saw those arguments in the court on Monday. Or we could try to find other examples. So as a matter of fact, Xenophon and Glaucon, 2 people in the room, are 2 students of Socrates, 2 people who were highly influenced by Socrates. Now, I think across both sections, only one Xenophon really emphasized their own influence by Socrates. Maybe a Glaucon did too. But one Xenophon took it especially far to provide this sort of positive first-hand characterization of the influence of Socrates. So that's one way to go. The defense could also look at, and in many cases reject, the prosecution's characterizations of Socrates' actions. So, for example, is Socrates really hypocritical? This is one that we saw rejected. The prosecution says that Socrates is going around showing that people don't know anything, but then he claims that he himself doesn't know anything. But that's not hypocrisy if Socrates never claimed to know anything in the first place, right? The people that he is that undermining or showing not to know anything are people who have claimed to know. So there is a potential difference there. That might be an example of how you can undermine, like, the claim that Socrates actually did this thing. But some of the things on their list, Socrates really did seem to do. So another strategy would be to look at the actions themselves, even assuming that they are correctly characterized, and deny that they have a corrupting influence. So say it was claimed that Socrates' questioning of people and showing them not to know anything, especially if he's questioning various craftspeople or politicians or religious figures or whatever, if he's questioning these people and showing them not to know anything, you might say, this thing that he's doing, these actions he's engaging in, these are corrupting. Whereas you might say, no, that is what he's doing, I admit, however, this is not a corrupting thing to do. So we saw people try to make that argument, that this kind of questioning is a good thing, it's not a corrupting thing, and that insofar as people reach either absurd conclusions or no conclusions or whatever, that Socrates isn't responsible for the conclusions that are reached by questioning, engaging in logical argumentation. The idea is that basically this is a good method for figuring out what's true and what's not, what's justified and what's not, and we go where the argument takes us. Now, of course, that you might respond to that if you were in the prosecution. So. Or we could go an alternative route entirely and not focus on Socrates specifically, but on general principles. So stuff like free speech. So the Miltiades characters in both sections really emphasized Periclean democratic values and free speech. Now, as the game master trying to stir stuff up, I put out there to a few people who I thought might be against this view that, what about Socrates' views on free speech? Especially since Socrates doesn't defend free speech. He didn't use that defense in his own case. His views in the Republic certainly aren't consistent with free speech. There might even be reasons for why you might reject free speech, or even if you're on Socrates' side, like mere toleration isn't what we're looking for here, whatever. But at any rate, Socrates didn't reject free speech. I was hoping to shake stuff up by getting that in there, but there's still this question of like, so what? And in one section, I think the 7 p.m. section, Miltiades responded with, so what? Who cares what Socrates himself said? Which is right. Either the free speech argument is good or not. It doesn't matter what Socrates actually believed. But it is still an interesting point that just historically and for understanding the views and which ones are right or wrong. Like Socrates wouldn't have argued for free speech. Now, I assume Miltiades is a Periclean Democrat because there's, one of the rules in the game is that the Socratic faction can only give good Socratic arguments and can't just go like the free speech route. But Periclean Democrats certainly can, because who cares what Socrates says? What matters are the principles we ought to uphold in our community, our government, our state. Okay, so that ends my look at the kinds of arguments we saw for and against Socrates on impiety and corrupting the youth. And now let's look at the trial of Lycon. So in the 530 section, Lycon was put on trial. In fact, in both sections, both Lycons and a couple of other characters in the 7 o'clock section at least, were citing association with the 30 or some kind, in some way or another, as a reason to convict Socrates. And nobody really pointed out initially that this conflicts with one of the laws that you guys passed as an assembly, right? And so I was, as game master, trying to put out notes, like someone should notice this, and I was also trying to stir things up by maybe having somebody put Lycon or whoever had mentioned it on trial, because it's trial day. Anyone could be put on trial, not just Socrates. And importantly, for some kind of historical or accuracy reasons, as we talked about when we read the Apology, there is this underlying, claim about treason here, and part of why he may have been convicted, even though it was not mentioned, was that this does follow the Peloponnesian War, the downfall of Athens, submission to Sparta, and the rule of the 30, and Socrates was associated with many of the people involved in this, and so that really might have influenced people's thinking, but nobody could have come out and said that because, hint, hint, in history, they actually passed a reconciliation agreement much like the one you guys passed. So at any rate, here's the argument in standard form. Premise 1, remembering the past and bringing lawsuits against supporters of the 30 is illegal. 2, Lycon cited the 30 in their justification for the claim that Socrates' ideas are corrupting. Thus, Lycon has done something illegal. And he was voted guilty, and then I believe the 2 punishments proposed where he loses his votes for the day, and Lycon proposed that he gets a round of high fives. And the jury voted for vote loss. Now maybe if Lycon had proposed something that was a real censure rather than a round of high fives, maybe wouldn't have lost their votes. Hard to say. But that's the way it went. Now, in turn, Lycon considered prosecuting his prosecutor for mentioning the 30 in their accusation of Lycon, right? And so this brings up an interesting question. One is that Lycon was connecting Socrates with the 30 in their attempt to prosecute Socrates. However, he still wasn't prosecuting him for his relationship with the 30. As in, it wasn't like Socrates supported the 30. Supporters of the 30 ought to be punished, so Socrates ought to be punished. It wasn't like that. It was Socrates is arguing for this terrible idea. This terrible idea sounds exactly like we had with the reign of the 30. Question, is that true? And that's the problem. So he isn't really claiming that Socrates supported the 30, and that's the problem, right? But you guys passed a pretty broad law, which is that just any kind of remembering or attempting to associate people with the 30 is legal. How should this law be interpreted? And if it's merely just saying the words the 30, like now references to the 30 tyrants are on a par with saying Voldemort, then that's a really strong law. So just emphasizing the importance of remembering the past, and honestly, I think Lycon was probably unjustly prosecuted, and also it was my fault for bringing it to prosecution, but I wanted to stir up the pot. I thought it would be a lot of fun. I thought Lycon would also like it, and I wanted to make this point about this probably was a real factor in the trial of Socrates that nobody could mention. And as long as we're talking about the real trial of Socrates, it's also worth noting that all these references to the Euthyphro and to the Republic wouldn't have been in the trial because those didn't exist, and maybe are largely creations of Plato's own, creative mind. But if Plato is roughly capturing the kinds of things Socrates did and said, then, we did read the Apology, and we certainly did have these claims about how he would interrogate people's beliefs. That seems to be a real thing that Socrates did. So, at any rate, that concludes my commentary video for the trial day, which was a lot of fun. Another thing that came up in trial day was there is a spy amongst you. And in one class, we debated what to do with that information. In the other class, we didn't, so I'll include that in the next commentary video, so stay tuned.